Good morning, everybody. It's time for everybody to log on. Morning, Chris. Hey, Martin. Hey, Lorena. Good morning, everybody. It's like a quiet one today. That's all right. Hey, Chuck. I could kind of use one. Hey, Kelly. Hey, Carol.
Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with
But then again, when it's quiet, no.
Band
Where's my dopamine? Hey, Chuck. Hey, Timothy. Hey, Kelly.
In Chicago. And first of all, one
Morning,
of
Vanya and Karen and Becky, Octavio. Hey, Emily and Kathy. Morning, Dad. Hey, Cindy and Gail and Lisa, Bridget, and Mary Jo. Trying on Twitter again. At least I got the right title this time. Hey, Kathleen. Hey, Larry. Hey, Jim and Linda in Boston. Hey, Jenna. Morning, Jim. Hey, Judy. Hey, those of you watching on Twitter. Streaming to Twitter is kind of a new thing around here. Hey, Mama, Susan, and Heather, and Beth. 10 days, that's coming right up. Morning, Cheryl. Morning, Marita. Oh yeah, today's the Southside Irish Parade. I saw the picture of Lightfoot in a kilt. Hey, Jenna. Hey, Luann. Hey, Kim. Morning, Kathleen. Hey, Jane, Patty, and Christine. Those of you just joining us, this is the first 10 minutes or so. It's kind of a pre-show build-up. Hey, Toby. Octavio, I hear it's going to be like 50 today. I'm still dressed in a nice warm cardigan. Hey, Gladys Satad over on Twitch. Natalia, good point. Honestly, that comment is like, I have so little problem with her saying stuff like that. I got plenty of problems with her, but... Hey, Emily. Hey, Mona. Hey, Ian. Morning, Nancy. It's about time to get some... Yeah, I haven't done put up more walking tours yet because yesterday was so cold and it's such a crapshoot at this time of year. But it's about time. Hey, Jen. Hey, Christine. Morning, Casey and Grace. Hey, Dirk.
Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing With All My Heart.
And hey, everybody over on Twitter. We'll get started in about 5 minutes or so. A couple minutes after. Nice and warm tomorrow, too. Tomorrow I got an interview with another cable show that wants me to do some talking head work. I got a couple of them backed up. I was like, oh, they better not make me fly to California twice. That would really be annoying. It's a lot of travel for no pay work. I don't know if it's just a pandemic thing or what, but it used to be they always filmed me in Chicago. Now they keep wanting me to fly places to do talking head work for no money. Hey, Paula. Yeah, Bridget, March is all over the place, but April is the cruelest month. Thanks, Trish. I wish I could film everything when the weather looked like this. I gotta really get lucky for some of these. You're careful with all my heart. And if I were lyrical, I would write a song. Hey, Georgia. Hey, Betty. Susan the Benny's cute. So. Audrey, they pay for the flight, but it's a working vacation. They'll cover most of the expenses, but, you know, I see the hotel, and if there's a mall across the street from the hotel, I'll see the mall. Hey, Dina. Morning, Lauren. Grace, no, that's Helen Ward singing with Benny Goodman. Well, hey, that sounds fun. Hey, Nipur.
Benny Goodman goes way back and gets a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny, Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Morning, Gary, Semper Fi. This is Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago, a couple of blocks away from Madison. Well, the weather will be good if it's California if we do it really soon. I don't like it being too hot. Hey, Grandma Bell. Flying's such a pain in the neck. Hey, Nancy. Hey, Wendy. Hey, Brendan. But hey, it's exposure, and I actually do okay from exposure with these things. They help. At least a little. Hey, Grace. Hey, McKinsey. Katie, I assume so. If I go to LA, I'm definitely gonna try to see him. Well, Carol, I'm fine with wearing my mask in the airport. It cuts back on travel crud anyway. You see that video of a guy who was just sitting there eating a whole box of cereal so he wouldn't have to put his mask on? I really wanted to go up and make fun of that guy. Like, you know, you could just eat one bowl of total. Bob, walking tours might start in a few weeks. Boker Tov, Lisa. Hey, Paul in North Carolina. Octavio, I never meet the other talking heads. Nor do I meet the host of the show, which would be kind of cool because the next couple of them that I might be doing are hosted by interesting people. I almost hate to say it, but the best one I did was Russia Times TV talking about H.H. Holmes. They picked me, they did it locally, but they picked me up in a black SUV. I'm like, ooh, this is a bad guy car. I went back and forth on whether I should even do it, but this was like before there was a war on. It's not like I'm going on to spread propaganda. I'm just talking about a dead murderer. Not that there aren't people I've turned down for Holmes stuff. If I go on the show's Twitter and am horrified, I'm not going on it. Alright, that's awesome. Most shows I don't meet the other talking heads. Like on American Ripper, I met pretty much everybody who was also on that show. But it wasn't all just talking headshots. It was like me sitting on the couch talking with them. And we had a good time, honestly. I thought the show was very silly, but I had a good time on it. Hey, Martha. Alright, we'll let Benny Goodman finish up another song or so. Hi to those of you joining us over on Twitter. A couple of you. Well, one of those is me, so hi you. Good morning, everybody. East Lansing? Is that where Magic Johnson's from? That's about all I know of, Eva.
Music by Benny
All
Goodman
right.
is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. And now, Benny Goodman's arrangement.
That's right. Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. The Joseph Urban Room is no longer extant, but still, I like opening with something local like that. So, all right, welcome along, everybody. I think it's time to get started. So, welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out. I'm on the History Channel and the Travel Channel all the time. So I am incredibly famous. Not as famous as Priya here over my... One day I'll figure out how to point on this thing. Over my shoulder. All right, among my books are Mysterious Chicago, the book, Ghosts of Chicago, now a rare collector's item, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, thankfully not quite so rare a collector's item, the brand new Murder Maps USA, which came out through Thames and Hudson a few months ago, and coming this summer, Graceland Cemetery, The True History of the White City Devil. I'm experimenting with marketing this one on TikTok. I've got a whole bunch of Graceland videos up on TikTok. It's the same name as my Venmo and my Patreon down below. I'd like to get that one for Twitter, but the one guy who has that one has never once tweeted. He's been sitting on it for 10 years and he's impossible to get a hold of. But all right, everybody. So we started doing virtual tours a couple of years ago. We're a couple of weeks off from the 2-year anniversary of doing virtual tours here. In the course of research, there's a lot of times when I find so many things on one stretch of road that I've made an entire walking tour out of it. In this case, this is one that we couldn't really do in person as a walking tour because the walk ends up going just a little further than people would want to go. It's about... We're going to cover about 3 miles of Madison Street, but there's just one of those places where there's one story after another. So we're going to start right here, right near Michigan Avenue at Madison and Wabash, at this recently rebuilt train station that looked like this until really fairly recently. And we're going to tell a story from 1921. There was a woman by the name of Jeanette Hoy who had fallen in love with a friend of hers. They both lived at a place called the Eleanor Club. There weren't too many apartments that would rent to single women at the time, so a couple of places like the Eleanor Club sprung up that were specifically for single women. They both lived there. They became good friends. Jeanette wanted to be more than friends. When she made this clear to her friend said, "I never want to see you again." And Jeanette started sending her letters, sending her presents, sending her money, just begging her and begging her to take her back. Then finally, she sent her a letter saying, "If you don't take me back, I can't be responsible for what I will do to myself." Attached to this letter was a bullet. And the police tried to talk to Jeanette about it, but the next day, Jeanette came running into a cigar shop right here at Madison and Wabash, bleeding from 3 bullet wounds, and said, "Excuse me, may I use your phone?" and then collapsed. She had gone into this train station where she knew her friend was going to be, shot at her friend, then ran downstairs to below the railroad tracks, shot herself 3 times, then walked into that cigar shop. Now, this friend was not actually hurt. She would spend a day in the hospital, but it was only a flesh wound. Jeanette, too, had not particularly hurt herself with the 3 shots. The friend declined to press charges, but now Jeanette at least realized, no, she probably isn't going to want to see me ever again after this. Now, a few years later, she was involved in a similar affair with another woman, but before she could shoot at that one, she was taken to an asylum. And that's where the story takes a tragic turn. I mean, I'm not really on Jeanette's side in the beginning. We can understand that what she was up against being a lesbian in her time, but it's never okay to go shooting yourself or others. However, once she had gotten into an asylum, that's where her story ends. I hope that she got help. I hope that she came out okay, but I can't find another record of her after 1924. So you kind of hope that the worst didn't happen within the asylum. But let's move to something slightly cheerier. We'll take a quick spin here past, you can see when I filmed this. We'll just go down the block a little ways here. Now, across the street, you can see this place with all of those windows on the top couple of floors. All of that glass just happens to be the site of a theater that was there up until about the 1970s. It was the old McVickers Theater. This is how it looked as of the 1890s. It would have been right underneath me right here. So try to put it right in the exact place. There were several different iterations of it. There was one of it before the Great Chicago Fire. This is the one from the 1890s. Various versions of it survived up through the 1970s. It went from being a place to see Shakespeare plays to a vaudeville place to a movie palace. I think by the end they were just showing like kung fu movies and stuff. But we talk quite a bit about Mary McVicker on the Rose Hill Cemetery tour, who married Edwin Booth. So this was John Wilkes Booth's sister-in-law. Now, Mary McVicker was the daughter of the family that owned the theater. She started out as a child actress in the 1850s, but after she outgrew that, she stopped acting for a while until Edwin persuaded her to get back on stage and play Juliet to his Romeo. They later got married. Reviews of her Juliet were absolutely terrible, but she managed to have a career for years and years. But Edwin wasn't the only Booth who had played here. Back in 1862, in the early days of the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth played there for a few weeks as well. Mr. McVicker had specifically courted him to come there. He wasn't quite as famous or quite as well regarded as his more famous brother, but John Wilkes Booth was a pretty well regarded actor, very popular, kind of a matinee idol, had a very erratic style of acting. The Chicago Tribune said that he was a genius, and he told the Chicago Tribune that his favorite play was Macbeth. Now, just imagine this. This is one of several plays that he did during his stand there where he spends a lot of time plotting to assassinate a head of state. How weird must that have been to have been in that show, and then a few years later after Booth did what he did? Now, over the course of this, he played several different Shakespeare roles over the course of a few weeks, plus a show called The Apostate, which was all just blood and guts and gore, and not particularly well regarded. The McVickers building wasn't just a theater also. There were things like a photographer in there, and there was actually a bit of a connection to, I don't know where the photograph went there, but H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy, has a bit of a connection there too. One of Holmes's known victims, of whom there is no photograph, is a woman by the name of Emmeline Segrand. Emmeline Segrand dated H.H. Holmes throughout mid to late 1892 before disappearing in December of 1892. There are lots of drawings of her in newspapers that were based on photographs. But the photographs are not really known to survive. However, one of the shows I was working on, they came into possession of a box of stuff that had some Holmes things in it, plus a whole bunch of unidentified photographs. One of those photographs looked like this. I'm just going to show that there for a second. because I'm not really supposed to show it, but it looks kind of like a match, and it was actually taken in the McVickers building. And we do know that one of the witnesses who talked about Emmeline was a woman she had come to visit, an old friend of hers who was living in this building at the time. So that's about as good a provenance as we're likely to get on this. I mean, there's nowhere near enough data that we could actually say that it's her, unless her name was scrawled on the back or something. But we know that it kind of looks alike. We can actually trace her to having been in this building at the right time. We'll never know for sure, but it's pretty close. So that always struck me as pretty cool. Well, let's move a little further down. Move down to Chase Tower. One of the more iconic buildings of the Loop, really. But this in 1928, this was the site of one of the most famous gang hits we ever had here. A guy by the name of Tony Lombardo. In 1928, Tony Lombardo became head of the Unione Siciliana, which was a job that technically made you the head of the mob. I mean, guys like Capone and Torrio didn't do anything without the okay of the head of the Unione Siciliana. But it had a very short shelf life. People were fighting and fighting over getting this job, but nobody seemed to last more than a couple of months at it at this point, because immediately you'd be assassinated by somebody else who wanted the job. And Lombardo was killed in late 1928. Officially, there had been kind of a gangland truce going on for a little while. 1926, the gangs got together and said, okay, let's stop shooting at each other. Then they all went and had a party and said things like, hey, remember that night that we chased you down with it went down and we're almost going to shoot you? What a fun night that was. But then Lombardo was shot down right here at Madison and Dearborn, right in the middle of the Loop and right at rush hour. It was one of the most public hits that was ever made in this in this whole entire thing. There you can actually see his body lying there. You can see a manhole cover that is no longer present. You can see everybody is wearing straw hats. You can tell it wasn't quite winter yet. It was generally thought at the time Lombardo was an ally of Al Capone. Capone desperately wanted to be head of the Unione Siciliana himself, but not being Sicilian, they wouldn't let him. But Lombardo was kind of a puppet of Capone. But a couple of months before, Capone's old boss, Frankie Yale, had been shot in New York. He had been working with Capone and Torrio for years, but now he had switched sides and started working for the Bugs Moran gang that ran the north side of Chicago. So, by assailants unknown, he was shot in New York City. This was thought to have been revenge for it. So there's probably possibly people working for Moran and Joe Aiello had come to get him. This is a kind of an interesting thing. The way that they were able to get away with shooting him right in the middle of the Loop like that is they were bringing an airplane into the building to serve as like a premium, like something like a doorbuster to get people into a department store. They were going to have an airplane displayed in the place. So while they were moving the airplane into the window, everybody was looking up and didn't notice that somebody else had a gun pointed at his guts right on the street. Now, to this day, they don't really know for sure who shot him, but not too long after this, about 6 months later, there was a list of all the available bullets that had been saved. The Northwestern University it started up a forensics lab for the Chicago police, and he is right down there at the bottom. It's a list of all of the bullets they had saved that could be analyzed. Over on the right next to him are the St. Valentine's Day Massacre victims. This is a couple of months later, and they were able to determine that the same gun that killed Frankie Yale was used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre later on. They can tell this by, like, markings on the bullets. It's really fairly interesting. But once again, it's one of those things we'll never know for sure who was involved in this one. But it was one of their most public hits. You tend to hear all these stories about the mafia, like dumping bodies in a pond over on the south side or something. They didn't usually do that. They wanted these bodies to lie where somebody would see it. Killing them was supposed to send a message. It was often done fairly publicly. Not usually as publicly as one of the busiest intersections in one of the busiest cities in the world at the busiest time of the day, but about like that. We'll proceed a little bit down from here. As we get a little bit further around the Wells Street area, Rodney, it's not so bad now that Leroy Brown is gone. As we get around over here, we're getting to the place that used to be known as Newspaper Row. Used to be that there were lots and lots of newspaper places here. Like this is the Chicago, the Record Herald. The Madhouse on Madison Street. That was the Chicago American office. But there were several places that called themselves the Madhouse on Madhouse on Madison. Over on the other side of these buildings, this is how Madison looked at the time. We can see off in the distance, you can see that same train station from the Danette Hoy shooting in 1921. But over on the left, these were mostly newspaper offices, at least on the second floors. And back behind it was the alley that came to be known as Newspaper Alley. Newspaper Alley was a place where the newsboys would hang out. Newsboys, here they are having a chicken fight. Newsboys were kind of an interesting group. They were largely self-sufficient. Many of them were homeless. Many of them just slept on benches that were set up for them in little rooms at the back of these buildings. They were one of the most diverse groups in the city. That's not to say that they were the most woke or whatever the term would have been at the time. You know, these were largely unsupervised children, spoken a language all of their own. And it is often said that newsies became kind of like the farm team, the minor league for the gangsters, because a lot of them were employed as what was called newspaper sluggers. Places like the Examiner, the Tribune, and the Journal would hire newsboys to knock over newsstands that were selling other people's newspapers. It's hard to know exactly how much of this stuff was true because newspapers didn't generally report on it much. But as early as 1930, Dino Banyan, later the head of the North Side Mob, was said to have gotten his start like this. Colonel McCormick, who ran the Tribune, later said that 27 people were killed in this battle between newspapers over the course of the 1920s. Moses Annenberg was the head of the Chicago American for a while, later bought the Philadelphia Inquirer. Had some things to say about it as well. But since newspapers were the ones hiring this, they didn't want to talk about it. The only one that really did was a newspaper called the Daybook. Now, this was a very small newspaper. It's a good place to get crash courses on stories that were going on at the time. They talked about newspaper sluggers a lot because they were too small to hire any of their own. They didn't have too much to lose, so they talked about here, newspaper sluggers riot, no witnesses. Squads of newspaper strong-arm men clash, traffic blocked, hundreds of witnesses, 2 arrests, and no convictions. Now, in particular, they talked a bit about Spike O'Donnell. This is a newspaper from 1916. In the 1920s, Spike O'Donnell would become one of the most famous gangsters in the city. Outside of the circuit of like Capone and Moran, Spike O'Donnell was particularly well known. This is one thing from the era that we can actually connect one of the 1920s gangsters to the newspaper circulation wars of the 1920s. I've had several people, several TV shows have reached out to me saying, do you have proof of Dino Banyan being a newspaper slugger? And no, frankly, I don't. The only guy I can really name like this is Spike O'Donnell. And of course, one of the walls, besides just being Newspaper Alley, this was also the entrance to the old Whitechapel Club, the 1890s press club where guys who worked on the crime beat would hang around to drink wine out of skulls, dip their fingers in the ashes of one of their members who had died and been cremated out on the Indiana dunes, play with skeletons. They had murder weapons up on the wall. They were also way ahead of their time. They were also like the only guys of the 1890s who weren't wearing mustaches. One thing I found to reminisce about that, one guy said, yes, we were well ahead of our time. It wasn't like nowadays when people still see a man with his old Victorian mustache and shout beaver at him. I guess there was a thing in the 1930s. When you see somebody with a mustache, you shout beaver. I'd like to see how that would go these days. Move down just a little bit more. Down to Wells Street itself. That is gross. Yes, that was a photo by J. Ellsworth Gross back there. Right over here, now, throughout the 1850s, the Fugitive Slave Law had gone into effect. Throughout the 1840s, it was said that if you see a police officer in Chicago trying to arrest somebody that they thought was an escaping enslaved person, it was okay to attack that officer because they had no authority to do that in Chicago. And through the Fugitive Slave Law, that changed. They did have the authority and even the obligation. The Chicago City Council immediately said, no matter what Congress says, our police officers will not be required to do that. but many of them did anyway, and that led to a lot of unpleasantness. If somebody thought that somebody was being taken into slavery, there tended to be riots about it. This was the case right about here in 1857. There was a man named Thompson who was stopping in town with a kid named Samuel Gantz, a 16-year-old young black man who had been working with him as an apprentice since he was 2. And he was in Philadelphia. Sam Gantz was an employee, an apprentice. He was free to leave. But when they stopped over at a hotel around here, rumors started to circulate that he was being taken into slavery. So they brought in Alan Pinkerton to investigate. Pinkerton had just started his private detective agency a couple of years before and really had been in Chicago for a decade specifically to work on the Underground Railroad. So he went and investigated, talked to Mr. Thompson, talked to Samuel Gantz, decided, okay, he's free, he's just being taken someplace to accompanying his boss. But then the carriage was attacked en route to the station. They tried to bring Pinkerton out to talk, but as soon as people saw Pinkerton, they thought, that's Pinkerton the abolitionist. If he's involved in the case, it must be a fugitive slave case. So they ended up trying to drive away here. The carriage got attacked quite a bit, but finally they did manage to get away. But once Pinkerton made a speech, things calmed down a little bit. The Tribune had an interesting response the next day. There had been a pretty near riot, but they said, well, we cannot blame the colored men of this city for the jealousy with which they watch anything that looks like an attempt to take one of their color back to slavery, that bitter, crushing, terrible slavery which so many of them have suffered. This was before the Chicago Times was a thing. I can imagine the Chicago Times would have had a particularly different response to this. I've got a random picture here in the stack. I don't know what this is. I didn't label it. I don't remember what the connection with this was. I'll have to look this one up. I don't remember exactly what that's a thing from. Fun typo, anyway. All right, move down a little bit here. Once we get down to Wacker, a couple blocks away, we come to the Civic Opera Building. I actually had the wrong button up there. Let's approach it properly. By Graham Anderson Probst and White in 1929, one of the greatest buildings in the city. And also, they tend to have great signs, too. Like their sign will say, Carmen, bringing sexy back. This one says, we miss you, by the way, you look great in that mask. Now, this was being built in 1929. You could almost say that the place was cursed a little bit. As for one thing, 1929, the place opened November of 1929, just a few weeks after the stock market crash that kicked off the Great Depression. Now, you can see it's kind of shaped like a throne here. There's a whole lot of urban legends about that. Some people say Samuel Insull, the utilities kingpin who built it, said, one day I shall come back and sit in that throne. Some say it was the back of it was facing New York because he was mad that his wife couldn't make it as an opera singer in New York, which is not exactly true. His wife was never an opera singer. She was an actress, a fairly well-regarded one. By the time he built this, they were barely on speaking terms. He wouldn't have gone to that much trouble for her sake. It was another guy. It was Harold McCormick who wasted much of his fortune trying to promote the career of an opera singer of questionable talents. But the place was opened right after the Great Depression. Insull had been living up in the penthouse, but he lost all his money, had to flee. And even while it was first being built, there were already some tragedies with it. There was a worker who died on the inside of the place. 1931, there was a suicide inside of the place. But even more notably, when it was still being built, right after it had opened, right before it opened, a daredevil was killed in a fall. It was a guy by the name of Rudy Caminiti. His name is spelled a different way in every place that you look. Not only did he fall, he was a human fly. He liked to climb up buildings and then do flagpole sitting stunts on top. Not only fell off of it in full view of a crowd, but also landed on somebody. And quite as surprisingly, there's actually some newsreel footage of Rudy doing his act. Rudy Semino in this version. He does this off and on. Here he is up on a Michigan Avenue building. This might have been the Palm Olive or something. Stacking up. See, he's fine there. He only went down about 5 feet. This gives me the willies just watching it. This activates my fear of heights terribly. Which has only been in recent years that I've had a fear of heights. And really, it's not so much a fear of heights for myself as a fear of other people on heights. I freak out so much when I see people like sitting on a ledge. And he was okay with this one. But when he tried the same thing on the Civic Opera building, he was not quite so lucky. But right across the river from that is Hullibert and Ruth's Chicago Daily News building. We'll just walk right up to this. Now, up along the edge of it, I won't cover too much time on this. Up along the edge, they've got little frescoes showing the whole history of printing and showing little tributes to other notable newspaper printers like Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World or Medill of the Chicago Tribune, the Daily News' biggest rival. Notably, they did not have Wilbur F. Story of the Chicago Times. You all know what I think of Wilbur F. Story. Move a little bit further out. And around the other side of the river, getting into the West Loop area, this was the location where back in the 1890s, right kind of by where the Chicago Bat is now, the Bat statue, was a hotel called the Galt House. So 1891, there was a guy by the name of George Painter living nearby. He was up on Green Street a couple of blocks west from this. He was living with a woman named Alice Woman, who he had lived with for a couple of years despite the fact that they were not married. Minor scandal in the neighborhood at the time. Also, he didn't work. He spent most of his time drinking Alice's money away. And he was also said to be fairly brutal. But meanwhile, she was also having an affair with a guy named Dick Edwards, who was also fairly brutal. One night, the neighbors heard some commotion. A few minutes later, they heard George Pater shouting, "Are you all people dead? Alice has been murdered. Something has happened here." They found him walking around the apartment in kind of a daze, and Alice's dead body brutally murdered lying at the place. He said he had been at Schiller's Saloon at Madison and Canal, so just a little bit back from where we are right now. But while he was on trial, a couple of people who worked over here at the Gaunt House said that on the night of Alice's murder, a guy named Dick Edwards, the guy that was also dating Alice at the time, came in with his hands all covered in blood. And when people asked, he just said, "Oh yeah, I just finished trimming a woman over on Green Street." So he was brought to trial. There was a lot of talk about, well, maybe it wasn't George, maybe it was Dick who did this. However, Governor Altgeld was pretty sure it was really George, declined to intervene, so he was hanged here in Chicago in late 1891. Right before he was hanged, he said, "If I killed Alice Martin, the girl I dearly loved, the woman I loved so much that I would almost commit any crime for her, I pray this minute, my last minute on earth, that the eternal God will put me into eternal hell. Look here, gentlemen, if there is anyone among you who is an American, I say to him on his soul, I say, see that the murderer of Alice Martin is found." And then they hanged him very badly. The rope broke and he ended up landing on his head. He was bleeding so badly they thought that he was probably already dead, but just to keep up appearances, they dragged him back up, retied him, and slid him down the trap door and have him dangle there for a minute. So it turned out it may not have been either one of these people. In 1914, a guy named Jack Cade confessed to having gone in thinking that Alice Martin was a sex worker and ending up in a drunken haze beating her to death. This was held up a few years later in 1921 when people were trying to exonerate Sam Cardinella of the Cardinella Gang. He was under sentence of death, about to be hanged, the evidence against him was pretty damn flimsy. One of his lawyers told the whole story of George Painter, how George Painter had been hanged and then somebody else had confessed to it years and years later. Now, this happened now and then, that somebody was hanged and then somebody else would confess, but there wasn't enough info to know it was real. But this even came up in court. This was another kind of a twist in the case. I can't remember exactly what the connection was. I just happened to have it in here. This is Alice's brother killed his wife for a little while. They must have run with a really rough crowd, these guys. It also came up in the trial. A couple of the jurors said things to the effect of, well, even if it was all circumstantial evidence, a man who doesn't work and takes his girlfriend's money should probably be hanged anyway. No, I end up with no particular opinion on whether or not he did it. I can't be convinced one way or the other. Let's move over to Halsted Street. Halsted Street is just Madison is about 8 blocks north of Hull House down Halsted from here. And in 1915, there was a parade of the jobless and hungry right here in Madison and Halsted that ended up being attacked by the police. They were just marching. The pastor, there was a pastor who was marching along with them, along with Lucy Parsons, a widow of one of the Haymarket anarchists of the 1880s. Were marching down the street holding up signs saying, "We're just hungry." Here's Lucy Parsons herself in jail. But not too many pictures of her out there. And the newspaper coverage of this was really very interesting the next days. Jane Addams had a whole speech on it. Slug police, bullets fly, Haymarket widow and 20 others locked up after parade is stopped. Mary Wilmarth, one of the Hull House ladies who is now one of the Graceland ladies, came and bailed everybody out as she was occasionally known to do in these situations. And here's some interesting quotes from right afterwards. Like Reverend Irwin, who had been marching, said, the real IWW, the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world who were always accused of violence at the time, the real IWW are the police. They engaged in the business of manufacturing crime so they can have the glory of stamping it out. When the city of Chicago authorizes wild beasts to slug hungry men for publicly playing the words of the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," this city, I say, has declared itself to be anti-Christian, atheistic, and anarchistic. Now, this was also Jane Addams' conclusion, that they had just been marching there, the police had started beating everybody up just so they could pull up a riot so they could have the glory of stopping it. Now, Mary Wilmarth up here at Graceland lived right where the Congress Hotel was up to the Great Chicago Fire. Her house somehow survived it. But then the Congress Hotel, where Betty Goodman plays in the beginning of these these shows, bought the land from her and just on the condition that she was allowed to keep on living in it. Now, also, while we're here at Madison and Halsted, this is also this place where in 1920, Carl Wanderer came up to a drifter and said, "Hey, buddy, you got to help me out. I'm in the doghouse with my wife. She's about to have a baby, doesn't think I'm good enough to be a dad, so here's what I'm thinking. If you'll pretend to mug us tomorrow so I can punch you in the face and look like a real hero, I'll give you $10. And the drifter agreed to the deal. I mean, I know. I'll just tell the short version of this because it turns up on so many other tours, but Wanderer ended up not only shooting the drifter to death, but also shooting his wife to death. That had been his plan the entire time. He didn't want to be a dad. He wanted to get back into the army or something. There's not really a convincing explanation for why he did what he did. I've been through his trial transcript and everything. I've been through like the evolution of how newspapers covered the case. Really, there's just no particular explanation, but it all started right over here. He, too, was hanged in Chicago in 1921. When they brought him out on the scaffold, he sang a parlor song that was popular at the time called "Old Pal, Why Don't You Answer Me?" Newspaper critics who attended were divided as to whether he was a good singer or not. Scroll down a bit to one of my favorite places that we go to on the time travel pub crawls. Incidentally, one of those is coming up this weekend. Over on the right was the location of a bar called The Hub. We'll just move in here just because of this awesome, horrifying picture. Like, yeah, that's where I want to go to the salon. Make me look scary. Make me look like a Disney villain. But this was the location of a bar called The Hub back in the 1870s. The Hub was generally known as a bar for counterfeiters. In those days, there were like different bars that were circulated frequented by different kinds of criminals. The Hub was generally known as a place for counterfeiters, but it was also popular with grave robbers. It was run by a guy by the name of Mullins. And it was over here a couple of counterfeiters had lost one of their friends. He'd been arrested and taken to jail. They were plotting ways to get him out. Somebody came over and said, "Well, you know, I'm the boss of all the grave robbers in this city. Why don't we go to Springfield and we'll hatch a plot. We're going to steal old man Lincoln's body, then hold it for ransom to get lots of money and get your friend out of jail." So they made this plan right here on Madison in the Hub, the counterfeiter bar, under the supervision of Mr. Mullins. Did end up organizing a posse, went all the way down to Springfield. At the time, Lincoln was just a wooden coffin inside of a white marble sarcophagus. They managed to get the coffin about halfway out of the sarcophagus until somebody blew the whistle. One of the guys in their posse was actually working for the feds. So they were captured and charged with the attempted theft of a $75 coffin. I wish I could find more about the Hub. It really only ever comes up in stuff about the Lincoln grave robbing. It's amazing that there's actually a picture of the guy extant. Down the road and across the street a little bit. This is going to become the West Loop now. It's the Soho of Chicago. It wasn't really that long ago that this place was known as Skid Row. As late as the 1960s or 70s, people described it as like a ghetto consisting entirely of alcoholic white men. Old men hanging around constantly. But in 1907, Ben Reitman, who comes up a lot around here, the anarchist and radical birth control advocate, started the Hobo College back when the neighborhood looked like this. He started a college for hobos. He was over here, they could get a meal, they could get something to do, they had crossword puzzles for them, and they had lectures like how to sleep outside without getting caught, which roads are the best ones to get on. He did this in connection with Emma Goldman, his non-monogamous primary partner. Here's Ben himself. Now, eventually, the hobo started accusing him of being a sellout after he bought himself a car. But really, up through like the 1960s, this is still what this looked like. And here's Scott and Elise, our friends who show up in the time travel pub crawl portraying Ben and Emma at a recreation. Emma Goldman's grave is right over here, right near Lucy Parsons, in fact, over at Forest Home Cemetery. I can't remember where I'm going with this one. I was going from the Haymarkets over to the Emma Goldman's, which has typos all over it. This is kind of the radical section of Forest Home. And now where's doctor prefix? And just across the street from there, another one that comes up on so many tours that I won't get into too many of the details today. But right down here on Madison, a little bit east of Racine, where the children's haircut place is now, back in the 1880s was the doctor's office of Thomas Neal Cream. Kind of a tie with Henry Meyer for Chicago's first confirmed serial killer. This was a doctor's office where he was initially in trouble for an abortion patient dying on the table. He was acquitted of that one. Shortly thereafter, a woman came in, he performed an abortion on her and gave her really painkillers that were just loaded with entirely too much strychnine. Then he fell in love with a woman named Stott, decided they would have to poison her husband to get him out of the way. That was what he was caught for here in Chicago. He did a stint in Joliet. Mr. Stott's gravestone still says poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. But then eventually he got out of Joliet prison, drifted back to the UK, his native country, where he got right back to work poisoning girls who had come to him for abortions, giving them entirely too much strychnine. He was eventually hanged for that in London. Now, according to some accounts, his last words on the scaffold were, "I was Jack the." The implication being that he had admitted to being Jack the Ripper, but he was in Joliet prison at the time of the Ripper murders, so this was probably just the hangman talking. That particular hangman, Billington, really liked to tell stories around the bar room. I haven't been able to get a copy of the original article from it. There's just a lot of reprints and summaries that went around. It's I might have to go all the way to Bolton in the UK to get the microfilm reel. I'm not going that far for one article. We'll proceed up on the other side of Ashland. I don't have a video for this one, but there was a bar called the Bucket of Blood in the 1910s and 20s. There were actually a couple of bars known as the Bucket of Blood in those days. It was also called the Madhouse Cabaret. Run by a guy by the name of, I got the name here, Jimmy Murphy, who later tried to open a coffee shop. You know, it was the 1920s. It was a coffee shop, sure. But then in 1924, right before the big Chicago gang war really started, There was a guy by the name of John Duffy who'd been hired by Dean O'Banion to be a hitman. He'd been talking a lot of big talk about, yeah, I'm a hitman, I'm really good at this stuff, I shoot people all the time. Then they brought him to Chicago and he didn't really do anything. He just took up with his girlfriend on Carmen Avenue, kept on bragging, but not really doing anything. So at some point, O'Banion decided he should have him taken for a ride. At least that's the presumption. He was found dead outside of the road. He was generally said to be the first victim of a one-way ride. There's a lot of different suspects. We'll actually cover him more on the tour in Uptown next Sunday. But Jimmy Murphy of the Bucket of Blood is one of the guys who was accused of possibly having been involved. Jimmy Murphy, an Italian, once owner of the Bucket of Blood, a West Madison Street dive of other days, has dealt in booze, women, and guns all his life, believed to have been in the murder crew and missing ever since. Up above him, they're listing all of the suspects here. One of the other suspects was Al Brown, also known as Al Capone, manager of the Four Deuces, the most despicable resort ever kept anywhere, located at 2222 Wabash Avenue, always cheating between raids, known as a procurer all his life, used a revolver frequently, women often informed the police to serve his own purposes, took up booze as a means of getting pocket money when the vice profession was dull. He was under the wing of Torrio, worked with O'Banion, Miller, or anyone else. Duffy was, O'Banion made a point of having Duffy get picked up at the Four Deuces Club so it would look like Capone had been behind this. This is part of why John Torrio, Capone's boss at the time, started wanting to kill Dean O'Banion, which happened a few months after this fact. And they call him Thomas Duffy here, but that was one of the other murder bullets that was still in possession of the police about 6 years later when they started the forensics lab. They could have used a forensics lab down over here where United Center is now. 1885, there was an express company that picked up a trunk right about here where the statue is now to be shipped off to Pittsburgh. When they opened the trunk in Pittsburgh, they found it contained the murdered body of a dead man. They immediately arrested a few guys, Giraldi, Azari, and Silvestri, who were accused of having killed the guy. They said it was a custom in those days for Italian men to shave each other. They invited this victim in for a shave, then slit his throat and took all of his money, put him in a trunk, and mailed him to Pittsburgh. The evidence against them was really remarkably slim, but there was such prejudice against them after the story broke that they could only get Kate Kane Rossi to defend them in court. She was the only woman practicing at the time, tended to get a lot of the cases that nobody else wanted. In fact, one of the lawyers for one of the other guys was a black man. They would clash against each other in court using words that should really not be repeated anymore. It's tempting to think of Kate Kane Rossi, but some of the things she said to this guy kind of disqualify her from such. There was just recently a book about this one, The Chicago Trunk Murder, Law and Justice at the Turn of the Century by Elizabeth Dale, which makes a pretty compelling case that though these three guys were hanged, and in full view of way more people that weren't supposed to view a hanging in those days, the evidence against them was really, really slim. They didn't really speak English that well and had confessions probably tortured out of them, as tended to happen in those days. I got time for one more. We'll stick around United Center and go just a little bit further up. Right at the corner of what is now Damon and Washington was the old Roby House, old Roby Tavern. Namesake of the street, Damon used to be called Roby. Not to be confused with the Roby House down in Hyde Park, the Frank Lloyd Wright building. This was just a little two-story building that was said to be haunted for a long time by Mrs. Roby. She was said to be seen wandering around the place, wearing black robes with her hands folded like this. I don't know if it was one of those things that's actually true, that people actually claim to have seen this, but it sounds like such a spooky ghost, and I'm a sucker for a ghost walking around with her hands folded. Love it. All right, everybody, that takes us a little over closing time. So, quick plug for the upcoming events before I put the Benny Goodman back on. On Thursday night, St. Patrick's Day, we will be doing a virtual time travel pub crawl. For those of you who might be new around here, once I started doing virtual tours, I thought a virtual pub crawl might be fun. And then since it's virtual, we're not bound by time or space. We can go absolutely anywhere. So we'll be doing one of those. There'll be some musical guests. It'll be basically a repeat of the one that we ran last March, but I've got to look at my files. I don't remember what it was at all. Sunday morning, a week from today, we're going to be doing the Uptown Tales tour. Stories like this from the neighborhood around Uptown here in Chicago. Lots of stuff happening. There's also morning mini tours here on the Facebook, at least, every single day. Should you need a Mysterious Chicago sweatshirt, hoodie, etc., go to cafepress.com/MysteriousChicago. They have got everything you need. Coffee mugs, hoodies, Johann Hawk t-shirts, all kinds of stuff. So you too can rock out with your Hawk out. And with that, everybody, we will put the Benny Goodman back on and just hang out like we always do. Where's the right button? There it is. All right, thanks everybody for joining me. I'm Adam Seltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. Here is Benny Goodman. Edgewater Tales ought to be coming up soon, Beck. Edgewater and Rogers Park. Though the line between Edgewater and Uptown gets a little blurry. Thanks, Marita. Thanks, Diane. Toda rabah, Lisa. Time to pick up some Hamantaschen this week. I made Putintaschen earlier. I just saw a rap on TikTok. If you don't like Jews, then you better use caution, or we'll name a food after you like Hamantaschen. See you, Beth. Octavio, this is virtual. You can be 5 years old and come on the virtual time travel pub crawl. What you drink on there is on you. And you can just drink water, whatever. Thanks, Steve. Hey, Nick in Puerto Vallarta. We're actually at the end of the tour now. This is the post-tour hang. Thanks, Ava. What is the worst crime neighborhood in the 1920s? Tough one. There were quite a few. Laura, I'm thinking early April we'll get started. I just gotta double check my schedule with the travel groups, which is ever in flux this time of year. And also with these guys wanting me to fly to LA.
Harlem way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her. Trucking.
I'm going to go up to North Shore Bakery. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Okay, while we were doing that, about 1,000 people watched my video from this morning about Lavinia Lane, the Graceland Witch. Thanks, Gina, on Twitch. Yeah, Ava, I've only been to San Francisco once, but I loved it. Yeah, Audrey, that's a TikTok. The TikTok is the same as the Venmo and the Patreon. How is Miles this morning? Good question. P and Priya are both over on the couch here. And you know, I'm just using the regular microphone today so we can go see them. There they are. Aw. All over town. Yeah, Laura, I don't know if TikTok is actually going to translate to any more uses, to any more people coming to these, but it's certainly growing a lot faster than my Twitter did. Yesterday, I crossed the line of having twice as many TikTok followers as Twitter followers, and I've been on TikTok for like 2 weeks, not 14 years. And Miles being asleep, I'll probably just let him sleep today. But he's made his appearance. He's fulfilled his contract. Thanks, Trish. Thanks, Alex.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
Yeah, Audrey, so far I've been posting a TikTok of some sort every day. I don't know if I'll keep that up permanently. Bridget, I think I only had like 2 people watching on Twitter this whole time, so... I might as well keep it up on Twitter, just because, hey, why not? But hey, you know, I can put the a plug for the Graceland book at the end of a TikTok thing, and then suddenly it's got 40,000 views, so that's pretty good. Well, you guys remember a couple of weeks ago I showed those videos I made for the Just Kill Me book. I spent weeks on those videos, and like 80 people saw them. Hello, Amy. Those of you just joining, we're actually in the post-show hangout right now. Door is at 10 a.m. Central. Don't forget to check your clocks for daylight savings. If you forgot it was daylight savings, go on any social media page and find lots of people giving their takes on it. Lisa, it took me a long time to defrost from yesterday. Audrey, I'm not sure those videos, other than the morning mini tour that I showed a couple of them on, I'm not sure they're anywhere anymore. It was embarrassing having them up there with like no view counts.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and we stay right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra, and hear Helen Ward sing Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Spaghetti and meatballs, that sounds good tonight. Roasted a chicken yesterday. That came out pretty well. But you can't get good whole roasters at Aldi anymore. Jerry, sorry to hear about that. Oh yeah, my corned beef is ready to go for Thursday. You've been everywhere you go, any time of day. 1 year I'll do it right. Hey Corey, yes, the subscription service that I've got is the Patreon right down below there. Welcome if you're new here. This is actually the post-tour hang. We just wrapped up the Madison Street tour. No, we do stuff on the Patreon all the time. There's stuff on the Patreon up to 4 times a week. Which reminds me, I got to do this week's post today. Carol, Aiden's spring break is coming up, but it's not this week.
And we'll let the title speak for itself. Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
Thank you, Heather. I got some new Coyote picks this week for the first time in a while. I haven't gone through them yet, but I got them. Heather, Aiden's at Columbia. Cindy, you can't burn down a house with a crock pot. It cooks at very low heat. See you, Sue. Cookies, that sounds good. I still got some leftover pizza from the other night. We got from Tapia's on Clark. Which is just classic pizza. It tastes like the pizza you imagine the Ninja Turtles eating. Carol, I feel like every year I read something about why corned beef was used on St. Patrick's Day. Something about it being cheaper. At a time when beef was expensive.
And here's a short encore portion of Benny Goodman's forthright invitation at the beginning of his program. Let's dance.
We'll let Benny finish this on up. Now, spinach pizza is good.
We have been presenting the music of Benny
Bring it out of
Goodman
Geno's now and then.
from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
All right, everybody, that's Benny wrapping up, so I will wrap up as well. Upcoming tours include Virtual Time Travel Pub Crawl this Thursday night, and a week from today, bringing back Uptown Tales, a tour that has only been done once before. Also, we're getting to where the sunspot is coming in, so it's definitely time for me to be wrapping it on up. So thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. Thank you for joining the Patreon, Corey. Look forward to posting stuff for you this week. We're also doing a Johann Hawk over on that one now, too, so it's going to be all kinds of cool stuff. But thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, and stay safe, stay strong, and of course, if you can, you gotta stay spooky, everybody.